So good evening. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad that I want to thank CAC for allowing this meeting to happen and also for serving as a vehicle for continuing the work of Unite U-46. I want to keep my remarks short tonight because I know there's a great presentation and there'll be a lot of important discussions taking place. A few updates. Our next Board of Education meeting is this Monday, November 6th at the Educational Service Center. It will be streamed on YouTube, and there is a webinar option for those who want to make a public comment, although you're certainly welcome to come in person. That could be an interesting meeting. We'll be discussing some of the work that we've begun here, architects and buildings and so forth. So it's all starting to become a reality. We'll also be having a presentation on this year's state report cards. Another update is the Multilingual and Multicultural Education Department is resuming its parent support groups for families with children in the dual language program. The next session is Tuesday night, November 7th at 7:30 p.m. These groups are held virtually, and you can find the link to join on the calendar located on the home page of the U-46 website. And I should note that that calendar is a great resource for information about district's events, meetings, and holiday breaks, such as the Thanksgiving recess, which is coming up very quickly. That will get started for students as a non-attendance day on Wednesday, November 22nd, and of course, Thanksgiving is 3 weeks from today, so November 23rd. So thank you for being here, and it's my honor to serve on the Board of Education.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Normally we would have an administration update, but you're going to be getting a lot of that during the Unite U-46 session, so we're not having that. Next time we have reserved for public comment. If you'd care to make a public comment, please raise your hand and we'll give you 3 minutes. Anybody for public comment? Okay, great. We always like to move along from that portion of the event. The next part of our business agenda is our committee updates. Sarah?
Thank you. So I am on the Specialized Student Services Committee, and last month we had a wonderful virtual turnout at our program on executive function by Joey Williams on October 24th. If you'd like to learn more about it, we will, or we might have already, posted the presentation on the CAC website. Our next Specialized Student Services meeting will be, again, virtual on Tuesday, November 28th via Zoom. And the Zoom link is posted on our website, on our CAC website, if you're interested. And I hope there are people out there who will join us. All right, thank you.
Great. I highly encourage everybody to do that. I was lucky enough to tune in for their last presentation, and it was very educational, instructional, and it applied really to everybody. So I would encourage you to check that out, follow the link. You can watch the recording of that. Next, Ian with Specialized Student Services. I'm sorry, instructional initiatives. We can just change it to curriculum.
All right, good evening, everyone. So we just had our last instructional initiatives meeting with Mitchell Briesmeister came and gave us a great update on pathways. I appreciate his time, and we've sent him some questions. We hope to have some additional discussions about pathways and magnet academies in the January meeting, so stay tuned for that. Our next Instructional Initiatives Committee meeting is November 29th. That should be the Wednesday after Thanksgiving. We'll be talking about U-46 Rising, and we'll be hoping to go deep into results and reflection, and look forward to that. It is, as always, all of our meetings, it's open to the public. You don't need to register. You don't need to sign up. You don't even need to say anything. Come and just listen and learn what you can or what you'd like to learn. So the announcement will be on the district website, that homepage that Sue Kerr was talking about, very useful. Just go there to the calendar and it will be there. That's November 29th. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ethan. All righty. That kind of wraps it up. Is there any other business from any of our members tonight they'd like to bring up? I would like to mention that everybody should have got a couple of really nice, colorful handouts here. They got those QR readers on them. If you didn't get one, raise your hand. I'll bring it over. If you want, I'll even scan the QR code for you so you can get yourself registered. But I do recommend you do that tonight. These are great things just to remind yourself. Everybody has a very busy life, a busy, hectic calendar. Sometimes it's helpful to get a reminder, you know, hey, you signed up for the Unite U-46. Thanks again for coming tonight. And motion to adjourn? I will make that, and someone can second it. All right, thank you. Next, we'll move on to the Unite U-46 portion of this agenda. And Brian, are you starting us off? Sonia.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. You might start.
Okay, excuse me. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Unite U-46. Ivy, and I'm an alumni and have a senior in the U-46 school district. So we're glad to see so many of you out today, and we look forward to a great conversation and hearing your feedback. If you haven't already, we'd like for you to just take a moment and introduce yourself to someone new around you. We will be working in small group activities later on in the evening, so just take a time and introduce yourself, and it's designed to give feedback and guidance on how to move forward. I don't know, when you came in, you should have received a packet or a folder. We do have a section. If you have any questions or comments, those out. Otherwise, you can go to u46.org/let's talk and fill it out online. And if you need,
Give us the folders when we go there, right?
oh, they did. Okay.
Yeah, so tonight, because we're going to do the activity out in the room, there's a lot of materials that you didn't pick up. They'll all be waiting for you out there. So.
Okay.
Sorry, it's a little bit different setup.
Okay, different setup. Okay. All right, so let's get ready to talk. Explain what's going to be in the folder. Okay. No, I mean, I can explain. I'm just saying. Okay, so when you receive your packet, we'll have the agenda will be in there. Tonight's agenda will be reviewing the elementary building analysis and priorities. We'll be talking about the findings from elementary site visits. And we'll do a scenario playing activity at the end to close it out. You'll also find the verbatim responses from the last meeting along with the executive summary and presentation slides and the work activity. So at this point, I will turn it over to Brian Lindholm, Chief of Staff for U-46, to start tonight's presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sonia. So as Sonia mentioned, tonight we're going to do a quick review of some of the data. If any of you were at the Elgin High School session in October, I will be sharing some of the same data on our elementary schools because I think it's important that everybody's starting with that same sort of baseline set of data, and it will be used for the activity later tonight. So I'll go through that portion quickly, but some of it may look familiar if you were at the meeting last month. And then I'll introduce Carrie Matlock, who is an architectural services partner who the district is working with, and she and her firm DLA Architects has visited many of our oldest elementary schools this fall, and so we've got some findings for kind of what we've seen from doing probably a dozen or so visits, and we're really starting with our oldest elementary schools that were addressed as the ones needing to either be renovated, rebuilt, or retired during the initial Unite U-46 work. And then that leads into this scenario planning activity, which I've got high hopes for this, okay? So I'm really hoping that you guys find this informative and useful activity, because what we've done is we've teed up a hypothetical scenario, but it's very representative of the decisions that we're making on several of our buildings. So we'll describe a school for you, and then we'll present some different options of different courses of action that we could take and ask you to recommend what you would do if you were in the district's position and why. And we've got a series of questions to kind of help you lead you through that. So we're really hoping that the activity tonight is really engaging and that we get some great feedback. So as I said, the focus tonight is really on our elementary schools. Last session at Elgin High, we talked about middle schools almost exclusively. Since the referendum passed last spring, we spent a lot of time in our middle schools. Visited all of our middle schools several times and had some pretty significant recommendations and decisions that were made by the Board of Education that had us, committing to building some new schools, to retiring some of our existing schools. I mean, these are sizable changes for U-46. So we spent a lot of time going through that last time. Tonight, we're now going to move on to the work that's happening this fall and in this school year, and it's making some of those same types of decisions at the elementary level. So the reality, and I'm going to share some data with you here in a few minutes, is we are going to need fewer elementary schools in our district going forward because of both declining enrollments, but also we are going to be shifting our sixth graders out of elementary into the middle schools in 3 years. And that also shifts the capacity needs at the elementary level quite a bit and up to the middle school level. So I will share with you some slides that will really point you to the direction that we've got some decisions to make, and it may mean consolidating some of our under-enrolled elementary schools. And that's a reality that we're facing, and it's the responsible thing to do as a district. So the steps that we'll be taking in the process this year as we figure out our plan for the elementary buildings, first we'll be completing an audit of all of our elementary schools and really starting with the oldest elementary schools. So really we focused on the schools that were built prior to, say, 1980, and those are the schools that we've spent most of the time in so far this fall. So we will share with you some of those findings, and that's going to help us get to a point where we've got recommendations for a number of our buildings, and also to determine how many elementary schools will be needed. And as I mentioned, it will be fewer than what we operate today. We closed 2 elementary schools after last school year, and that was a start, but we will have to likely close a handful, if not several more, to kind of right size ourselves for the new reality of the enrollment projections that we're seeing. Before winter break, we are committed that we'd be coming back to the Board of Education with some recommendations on several of our buildings, so that is not far off, which I think of that every day. I'm like, there's not that many days between now and the end of winter break, so we've got a lot of work to do. But that was our commitment, that we would have some recommendations prior to leaving for Christmas. So I think there's a board meeting on December 18th, and that's kind of what we're targeting. And then at that point, I know a lot of people are very anxious about boundaries and what it might mean for your neighborhoods or your subdivisions. We really can't get to that point until we make some of these other decisions and we know which schools we're going to take different actions on, how many elementary schools we'll be needing. At that point, we'll be able to start looking at redrawing boundaries, but that's not that far off. That could be as early as January. And that will be a focus in some of the sessions in the spring at these Unite U-46 sessions. We'll be discussing our process and the different criteria for establishing those new boundaries. So look for that. So this slide, and we tried to get everybody, you saw we taped off so that you wouldn't sit in back. I'm sure some of these are still going to be awfully small. You don't really need to see the numbers. All you see is that it's going down and to the right. And this is our enrollment at our elementary level, okay? So the difference here, it's kind of following the same trend that we've been describing for the district overall enrollment until you get to that hash line there, and then you see it sort of step function drop down quite a bit. And that's when the sixth graders move from middle school to elementary school. So then there's a big drop in our elementary because all of a sudden you're pulling one entire grade level out. So that's 1/7 of our elementary student count that all of a sudden is going to be lifted from the elementary schools to the middle schools. But the net effect here, this is not that many years of data, guys. This is from 18-19 to 32-33. So this is 15 school years. And from the beginning of this forecast period to the end, it's a 40% reduction in the number of elementary students. So, I mean, just pause there for a sec. 40%, not 14, but like 40, like almost half. So when I talk about the need for consolidating some of these under-enrolled schools, what you see on the next slide, and again, the numbers, the actual school names aren't important as much as just to let you know this is a heat map of how well we're using the capacity in our elementary buildings. And just know that blue means they're running way below capacity, like they're half full or 2/3 full. If they're red, that means they're basically running right at peak capacity. They're basically 100% capacity. And then we have a handful of them that are in the gray, which means they're at about 80%. That's where we'd really want schools ideally. We don't want every classroom, packed to the gills with 30 students and the schools, the lunchrooms, the libraries almost overcrowded. So some of these that are like the deeper red, those are probably ones that when we address the boundaries, we may need to do some adjustments to bring the enrollment down a couple places. But I think the important takeaway on this is that you see we just have waves of blue and even the dark blue, which means there's pockets of our district where all the elementary schools are running literally like half full, 60% full. So, and this is looking forward to the year when the sixth graders move out. So this is 26, 27. This is after sixth graders have moved out, and it assumed that we didn't close any additional schools, that we kept the 38 elementary schools we have today. All of them are still open the same way they are now. This is what the capacity utilization would look like. And it's just to illustrate that if we don't do anything, we're going to be running not very lean or very efficient as a district. This was a slide that we showed last time that I think surprised some people, because it's a breakdown of like how old our elementary buildings are. So the headline here is that 2/3 of our buildings were built in 1980 or before, which means they're getting close to 50 years old or older. And several of them much older than that. Did you guys all know we had schools that were built in the 1800s that are still being used? We have 3 elementary schools that were built in the late 1800s, so they're 130, 140 years old. The 12 that were built since 1980, it's interesting because there was another stretch in the 70s and 80s when U-46 didn't build any elementary schools for almost 20 years. And then in the like mid-90s, there's a flurry where we built several new elementary schools, mostly in the southern part of the district, so in Bartlett, South Elgin primarily. But that was when the population was booming, many new housing developments, and we had a bunch of new schools that were built. We haven't had a school built since 2005, so it's been almost 20 years since our last school was built. And again, those new schools at this point are not really that new anymore. What we'll show you some tonight is that modern school design has come a long way, so even some of our new schools don't look that much like the schools that are being built today. And the other point here is, so 20 years ago, when the last time that we built a lot of schools in U-46, it was to address this population boom. And I've just told you how now the enrollment is declining. So it feels counterintuitive that we're going to need to be investing in building schools when our enrollment is going down. And in a sense it is. But on the other hand, we have schools that have very real needs, and our kids deserve access to the safe, modern learning environments as much as kids anywhere else, right? It's not their fault that the enrollments are declining. And we have buildings that are just getting older and needier and more costly, more difficult to maintain. So we have the same needs they have anywhere else. We're not having to build new schools to add to our overall capacity, but we are still having to update our existing buildings, and in some cases replace our buildings to fit the schools that they deserve. And that kind of leads into this slide then. This was taken straight from the Unite U-46 presentation to our Board of Education last December. So it's almost a year ago, which is impossible. It feels like it was a few weeks ago. But it lists several things here that we feel like all kids in all schools should have access to. And I'm not going to read you the slide, but one of the points at the bottom that's in the bold green font is that it says schools should be replaced when they've reached a point where they're more expensive to repair or to renovate than they are to replace. And we asked a question very similar to this when we did the survey of community members prior to the referendum. And we said, does it make sense to replace a school when it becomes more costly to do repairs or renovations, basically keep the school operating, than to replace it? And we had 82% of the people who said that makes good financial sense. So I think at some level this resonates with people, and it's like, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's like if you're driving an old car and you reach a point where you say, I'm done putting any more money in for like serious repairs into this car. The next time something goes wrong, I'm trading this thing in and getting a new car. And if Ann Williams, if I'd be superintendent of operations here, she'd probably tell me that's a terrible analogy. It's very sloppy and loose, but it was the best I could come up with. But to try to put it into kind of terms that maybe we all would understand. But at some point, we have buildings that have served us for 130, 140 years. They've served U-46 very well, but I don't know that they're serving our students as well as they should today. And there are updates that we really should be doing to our buildings that are almost impossible to do to some of our oldest buildings. So these were the schools that were originally identified during Unite U-46 to either be renovated or to be rebuilt or to be retired. So we have Illinois Park, which is an early childhood center. Washington, Lowry, and McKinley are our three oldest schools from the late 1800s. Then we have Hanover Countryside, Glenbrook, Century Oaks, and Parkwood. So these schools, we've visited all of these schools this fall with Carrie and team, as well as many of our other oldest elementary schools. And tonight we're going to share with you some of the findings from those audits. And again, when I said we would be coming back to the Board of Education with recommendations later this fall, we would have specific recommendations for what to do with each of these buildings, as well as potentially several others. So tonight, when we go through the results of these audits, these are some of the things that we'll be telling you that we found at each of our schools. We're going to be looking at how well we're using the available capacity, whether there are safe, welcoming, and easily identifiable front entrances. I was worried about that tonight, you guys, as I got here before this meeting, and I was like, wow, that looks kind of dark, and I'm not sure everybody's going to know exactly where they're supposed to go when they pull in here. So do any of you guys have that feeling? What I'm afraid of is we have a lot of schools that when parents come up, they're going, am I even at the right front door? And when they buzz and somebody lets them in, is the main office like right there? And is there somebody to greet them and take them where they need to go? Or are they sort of hoping that they can find where their way to where they're supposed to be? It's not the experience that we would want our parents or any other visitors to our school to feel. So that's one of the things that we're looking for. Are they accessible? We're going to say ADA accessibility. Some of our oldest buildings have parts of the building that are not accessible to kids in wheelchairs, on crutches, and that's not okay. Do we have equitable access to all of the learning spaces, meaning classrooms, art and music, common spaces like the library, the gymnasium? Are they on adequate acreage? So the current guidelines would say that an elementary school should be on 5 to 10 acres, and we have some elementary schools that are on 2 acres. Current guidelines would say middle school should be on 15 acres, and we have middle schools that are on like 4 or 5. So some of our oldest schools in Elgin, and it's nobody's fault, they were built so long ago that when they were neighborhood schools, everybody walked, so there was no concern for bus drop-off zones, parents didn't drive kids to school. There weren't the guidelines around green space and athletic fields and some of the things that now everyone just expects schools to have, right? And then that feeds into what kind of traffic flow, what kind of parking is available. We have some of our elementary schools that don't have any parking. Teachers park on the street and have to kind of walk to the schools. There's really no place for parents to drop off. Where's Jaron? Jaron's right here. I was just at Jaron's school, and he was telling me he is traffic cop every morning, directing traffic. I can picture it. It's got to be crazy, So last time when we were at Elgin High School, how many of you guys were at the last one? Good, that's awesome that so many people are back. So we asked you to come up with some of your top priorities amongst the criterias that we had been looking at. And the ones that rose to the top, I don't think it's any surprise, but it was good validation for us that the things that we felt all along were important, was what we heard from you guys as things that should be considered important priorities. So equitable access, secure and easily identifiable front entries, schools that are accessible, inclusive, and then dedicated spaces for subjects like art and music, which is not the case in many of our elementary schools. And then this one was interesting, and you guys will have this in your packet. I always think these are cool when you ask people like these open-ended responses where they can tell you what they think is important that maybe we didn't offer up as a choice. So this is like, what else should we be thinking of that maybe weren't listed as options? And then we do these, these word cloud analyses where we can see what words tended to bubble to the top in people's responses. And a few in here that caught my eye at least. So at the top, it says relationships. So I think as much, sometimes you can look at numbers and capacities and enrollments and space and facility assessments, and it's easy to say, well, that's an easy call. You just close that school, you move them all here. But it's like there are relationships. I mean, if you've been a teacher who's been at that school for 20 years, and you've worked with several people on your team, most of that time, that's not as easy as just saying, you're going to move to this other building, don't worry about it. You're still working for U-46, what's the big deal? Or if you're a family that sent all of your kids through this particular elementary school and you've got a deep connection to that school, it's around the corner from where you live, the kids have always walked. I mean, we can't underestimate the sort of the depth of the relationships that have been established in some of our buildings. data was a number that came, or a word that showed up here, and I was glad to see, because we've tried to be very transparent about sharing some of the data that we're using to make these very tough decisions. And I just want to make sure that it's recognized that we are trying to be data-driven here, and that we're using data to ground our decisions. There's one at the bottom that's boundaries, and I was surprised actually this wasn't in like giant, like 200-point font or something, because boundaries seems like something people are very interested in, and it becomes very personal, right? Like, what school will my kids go to, and where will the boundaries be drawn relative to my subdivision, say? So we know that that's something that people are anxious to get into, and as I mentioned to you, once we determine some of these courses of action on the different buildings, boundaries will be one of the next things that we tackle. And then finally, the word that probably showed up the biggest, and it's kind of angling up to the right from the bottom there, is change. And as I mentioned, we can't underestimate, these are massive changes in U-46 when we're talking about closing buildings, when we're talking about changing boundaries. I've been U-46 12 years. We have not done much, if any, of this. So I know that these are big, big changes, and that change makes people uncomfortable. And it's not a reason not to do it, because I think all along we knew that this Unite U-46 and some of this facilities work was ambitious work, and I think it's the right work. But we can't underestimate that these are significant changes that are going to have big impacts on people's lives, and we just have to make sure that that's always kind of front and center as we move through this process. So I'm about ready to turn over to Carrie here. Carrie Matlock from DLA Architects and her team have visited a number of our schools. I think we've been to like 15, 16 schools this fall at the elementary level. And what we have tonight is a summary of some of the findings. So we're not going to show you like, well, at this particular school, this is what we found. These are just general themes that we've found kind of across all of our oldest buildings, but that are things that we need to address. And it will start to sort of feed into the activity that we have for you tonight, because we're going to describe a hypothetical school that has many of these issues that Carrie's going to describe. So I'll turn it over to Carrie.
Well, this is difficult. I've got to use two hands. Good evening, everyone. All right. So what did we see? It's always interesting to see what architects look at. We're kind of an odd group to begin with. So we looked at the site, all the sites. We walked around the building perimeters and noticed the size of the properties. We also noticed that in some instances there were cattails. Anyone know what a cattail, what it likes? It likes water. So there were some marshy areas in some of the sites that we visited as well. And we all looked at the slope and how the building drains the water away from it, which is really important. We also looked at the lots, the asphalt, the areas of play, the grass, the green space that's available. Since we were visiting after school, we had the extreme pleasure of understanding your traffic flow. And we know this because sometimes we were caught up in cul-de-sacs around the neighborhood and waiting until all the buses cleared or all the parents cleared from picking up their kids. So we understand that there are some challenges at some of the buildings, certainly. We looked at the building envelope. And the building envelope, for those of you who don't know, is the materials that surround the building. So the walls, the roof, everything that keeps everything inside. And some of the pictures that are shown here, there's some masonry issues that need to be taken care of. There is a metal fascia that is rusted and needs to be replaced. There is some metal panel below the window that needs to be replaced. So there's some maintenance that needs to be going on some of these buildings as well. This is a nice little video that talks about the building flow inside. So it shows students moving about their day and cutting through one of the classrooms to get to their classroom, because some of the classrooms in a few buildings are stacked. So you have to traverse through one classroom to get to the other side, to get to another one. Sometimes you have to do that to get to an exit door. Sometimes you have to do that to get to the library. There's a variety of sizes and shapes of classrooms as well. And the way that you get to those spaces is sometimes very unique than what you would normally see in other buildings inside the district. The relationship of a corridor to a classroom is not as direct in some of the buildings that exist than others. There's also columns and some other infrastructure area, items in the way of getting around. We looked at the ceiling heights and any other limitations. So some of the ceiling heights were really low in some areas of the building because there's piping in place and a lot of other elements of the building that really cannot be removed. It's almost cost prohibitive to change this at this point, and they're very low, so hiding it is a challenge as well. So you can't really just put up a ceiling to hide those things like we normally would see in schools. But so how to deal with that is something to consider. We also looked at the space needs of the buildings. Now you can see in the picture on the right here that there's some storage in the hallways. That didn't look like it was just there for the week. It looks like it's been there a while, and that obviously it's a space need that's not being addressed. Also, we looked at the warming kitchens to determine and hear from the staff if they're sufficient or not. If we're to change the occupancy or increase the capacity of these buildings, we have to consider the cafeterias and understanding if there's enough space there to begin with, or will we need to enlarge it at some point as well. Accessibility. This picture shows a staircase that goes up to a classroom. That is the only way to get to that stair. It's to get to that classroom. There's another stair I believe on the other side of it that's leading down. But either way, this is certainly an obstacle and is not an accessible area for someone in a wheelchair. We looked at the mechanicals. We really talked and discussed the status of mechanical systems, electrical systems, plumbing systems, the infrastructure of the building to see if there were any problems that people were having. Acoustics. Here you can see walls that don't go up to ceilings and curtains that are in place of walls. There was a variety of wall types in the buildings that we visited. Some were movable, some had holes between them. Either way, the acoustics were definitely affected by the presence of these walls or lack thereof. Looked at the size and shape of classrooms. Some of them were very unique in shape. It also made it very difficult for teachers to lay out a teaching wall space or to gather different groups of students for different types of activities. It also was sometimes a very small space without windows. Secure and welcoming entrances, like we just talked about coming here. Certainly, I like to think that as an architect, I can identify an entrance to a facility. However, there were still challenges for me walking up to the building to determine which was the front entrance. So, and then once you get into the building, how close is the relationship of the main office to the front of the building? Do you have to walk across a corridor? Do you have to go up a staircase? Or is it adjacent to it? Is it right next to it? And then you have to, and when do you check in? So that process is very important in understanding what that means to visitors.
So one thing that Carrie mentioned I think was interesting was when we visited some of these schools, and Ian, you touched on the U-46 Rising that I think is going to be the focus of one of your next meetings. We've been trying to get teachers to have students work in teams and have more sort of active participation in their own education and not as much just stand and deliver where they sit and listen to the teacher lecture. And that's great for so many reasons. It's totally the right thing to do. What I think has been striking to us is as we visited some of these schools, they say with that, there are these schools that have the very open concept where you have to walk through one room to get to the other, or you've got these like fake walls in between the rooms. The teachers almost have to coordinate what time during the day they're going to do teaming activities, because like what we like to say is that can be really noisy, but in a good way, because the kids are up and moving around and they're talking, and if they're, especially some of the younger kids, they're very boisterous, and it's like, it gets to be noisy in a great way. But if you're the teacher next door and you've got kids who are like quietly trying to do a math test or something, like you may say, hey, you're killing me here. You know, I've got my kids trying to really concentrate, and your kids next door sound like they're having so much fun while they're doing this engaging teaming activity. But it's just sort of one more challenge that these open spaces presented, these schools that were built in the 60s and 70s that seem to have that sort of floor plan. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to lead you through this scenario activity. So this is what I talked about. So I'm going to turn back to Carrie in just a minute, but we're going to describe a hypothetical school. So this is not any single U-46 school. You might see some things that look familiar, and you might say, I bet that's that school they're talking about. Trust me, it's not a single U-46 school, but it's kind of like a composite of decisions that we're facing in many of our buildings, okay? So some of the images you'll see, some of the data that we made up tonight intentionally was not from an exact U-46 school, just so we didn't want people to see, well, I would hate to have you close that school because I love that old school and it's right in my neighborhood. It was sort of to take some of that emotion out of the equation. So we will describe this building to you, and we'll describe some of the strengths, some of the challenges, the age, occupancy, the capacities, some of the facility needs, the enrollments, all the data maybe that you'd expect to see. And then we're going to present you with a few options. And in the end, you can probably guess, we're going to say, okay, based on everything you've heard, what would you do? These options, would you try? There's a few other questions like what communities and how would you address based on the options selected. So I'm going to turn it back over to Carrie, and she is going to describe the school for you, and she's going to tee up the options, and then in a few minutes here, we're going to move out to the commons area, and we'd ask you to find a table with somewhere around 4 or 5 people at a table, and then we'll have all of the instructions for the activity and things will be there, and then we'll finish up the rest of the night out in the commons area, okay? So let me give it back to Carrie, and she's going to describe the scenario here.
All right. Okay, so we have Elementary School A, and it's a wonderful building. It's built in 1906, very small lot size, about 2.5 acres. We have a capacity for 400 students, but its projected enrollment for 27 school year is 250. It's got a lot of historical charm. People have sent generations of students there, and it's a neighborhood school. It's a landmark in the community. It's a dual language site. It's a neighborhood school. 80% of the students walk. And there's an experienced teaching staff, and they've been there for 20 plus years. And many families have sent their students to this school. It's a loved building. It also has some challenges. The challenges is because it's 100 plus years old, it's the highest annual building operating cost in the district. It's declining enrollment, and there's a roof that needs to be replaced. That's just going to be under $1 million. And then there's some structural issues as well, and that's about $250,000 to fix. Several of the classrooms are below grade level, and they don't have natural light. There's ADA routes that do not exist, and they cannot be created because of the way the building is laid out. And there are no routes for those in wheelchairs. Front entrances do not have a secured entry. So there's limited green space, and the green space that does exist has some flooding issues during heavy rains. And the parking and parent drop-off is a little bit of an issue because it occurs on the neighborhood streets. There is no parking on site because of that small site that exists. The good news is that there are 2 newer buildings close to this building, School B and School C. And they're in much better condition. They were built, one was built in 1970, one was built in 1996. And their enrollment projections are actually lower than what the capacity of those buildings are. So they've got some room for growth. So you have some options, and we're going to present 4 options to you, and you're going to need to decide what to do with this building. And the first option And if you've ever gone to a restaurant and you've seen those dollar signs, or if you looked at which restaurant you should pick by the dollar signs, there's some dollar signs here you're going to see which is the most expensive, at least for an initial cost. That's not to say the cost that won't increase down the road depending upon the option that you select. So option 1 is to renovate. So we're going to save the building. We will renovate and or add on to the existing building. Students will not need to be relocated to another building during the construction because we're going to construct it all while they're in the building, and will not be able to acquire any adjacent property. So you're still have the limited site, and the parking will still be off-site, and we'll still have some of those issues with traffic, but you will have an improved building because we'll renovate a little bit of it. Option 2 is to rebuild on the current site. So what we'll do, we will demolish the existing building and build anew on the existing site. Except the site is still very limited, so you're still going to have some of those site conditions, and there's no room to build a new building right next to it while you're occupying that building, so that building has to come down before a new one gets built. So students would be inconvenienced in having to relocate to a different building until a new one gets built. Option 3 is retire and rebuild on a new site. So we would identify a more suitable site that was located at a mile or at least within the boundaries of the existing facility, and we would retire the existing building once the new school is ready. We would build on that new site. Option 4 is to retire the school and relocate students. So we would update and modernize those two close buildings, School B and School C, to accommodate more students and programs along with the best practice in education. And we would retire Elementary School A, relocate Elementary School A students to updated Elementary School B and or C, and this would ensure that all students would have an improved learning environment because those buildings would have been updated to accommodate them. These are those 4 options kind of in a summary altogether, so you can see those cost differences. And really option 1 and option 4 are the lower initial costs, but they still have high operating costs. But they do have an improved learning environment. But option 2 and option 3 replace with a new building in some format, just a different site.
Okay, so I'm gonna go back through these real quick here. So, and one thing, this is why y'all have the packets, because I know that you'll have to refer back to some of this. But the point on option 1 here that we just wanted to make sure is that there's a lot of these schools that they may sit on really small lots, and maybe your first inclination is, well, I bet if you could just buy those houses across the street and stuff, then you could expand. And we just said, for purposes of this exercise, assume that you couldn't. Because you may have people who say, I don't want to sell. This is where I've lived all these years. This is my house. I'm not selling to you. I don't care what you offer me, right? So just for the purpose of this, assume that if the school sits on 2.5 acres, that's the 2.5 acres. And the point about, so that's if we were going to do an addition or something, you'd probably be very limited. So it would really be doing more updates kind of within the existing shape of the building. And then option 2, as Carrie said, because this is such a small site, assume that we would have to tear down the building first and clear that all out, then build the new school. So those kids would probably have to be sent somewhere else for probably 2 full school years while their school is being built, because the lot isn't big enough to build a new school on the other side of the lot while they're still in the existing school. There's just not space to have 2 buildings on such a small lot, okay? Whereas option 3, the beauty of this one would be if you could find another location a mile away, you just keep the kids in that school while the new school is being built, then you move them later. They don't have to get temporarily relocated to a new school, okay? And in 4, What we're saying here, this is sort of an important distinction, and we made sure that we did this with the Garfield and Hawk Hollow that we closed after last school year, is it's a promise basically to say if we're closing a school and we're going to send kids to another school, they're going to be going to a better, more modern, safer, newer learning environment. We're not going to close their 100-year-old school and send them to another school that's also 100 years old or 80 years old or something. We're going to send them to schools that are much better, much newer. And if we needed to do updates to those buildings or additions, we would. So that's the point where it says that we would update and modernize these schools as needed, such that when those kids get relocated there, these are going to be, vastly better learning environments than where they're coming from. Okay? So here's just, again, summary of the 4 different sites. So we're going to transition out to the space out here. And like I say, if you could try to sit at a table with 4 or 5 people, ideally, that would work fine. Hold on one sec. I got just a couple things. We're at the point transition. So at your table, there's a couple roles that we're hoping that somebody could be the recorder, which basically means you're the one taking notes for the table. And there's one sheet out there that we want you to capture what your table's feedback or comments are. And then we're going to collect that at the end because we want to make sure we get that feedback. And then we will ask for volunteers to share out. At the end, we'll all come back together. And if you've got some things that you'd like to share out for us to hear and for everyone else to hear, that would be awesome. We usually get lots of good participation there. So that would be nice if you did that. And then the other one is the facilitator. So the facilitator basically is the one to make sure that everybody has a chance to speak, make sure that you stay on task, make sure that you're watching how much time you have so that you're getting to all the questions. Facilitate, I don't know. Okay. And then the ground rules really, I'm not going to read these to you either. It's just like, be a good team member, let everybody talk. You've got this. So here we are for tonight's activity. And this is all on the sheets out there, but I'm going to read it to you anyway, okay? So based on what you heard tonight and these 4 options that we presented, list up to 3 challenges and 3 opportunities for each of the options. And we say up to 3, so don't feel like you could do 1 or 2 or whatever, but at least have some pros and some cons for why each of the options would have some merits and maybe would have some shortcomings. Because there's no doubt none of those 4 options are perfect, but they all have some benefits, and I think you'll probably see that as well. But then we say, based on what you've heard, which of the 4 would you recommend and why? So this is probably the heart of the question or the activity tonight. And then what additional information would you have liked to have seen? Because we wrestled with this a little bit. We could have bored you to death with like facts after facts after facts, but we wanted to make sure we gave you enough to at least make this activity meaningful and give you information to come up with sort of a reasoned opinion on which option we should go ahead with. But I'm sure you have ideas for like, well, I wish you would have shown me this, this, and this instead. And you could say, I don't know, want to know about new housing in the area or something, that was not part of tonight's activity. But if there's anything like that you say, it would have helped me come up with the recommendation if I'd had this data and I didn't see this tonight, that would be interesting for us to know. Then the second part of the task is, depending what option you selected, what sort of feedback or what sort of reaction would you expect from the people who are impacted? So the students, the staff, the families, the community that would be impacted by the option you chose. What sort of reaction do you think they would have? And then what would you do to help address some of the concerns or the questions that you maybe would get from those people based on the option you chose, okay? So I know it sounds like a lot, but I got a lot of confidence in you guys. I think you'll be able to work through this. We are going to give a little bit more time for this activity tonight, so I think the presentation went a little bit quicker than last time, so we're on schedule. We're going to give 30 minutes to do this as groups, and then we will ask you for volunteers to read out, and hopefully we'll hear from several of the tables, and then we'll get everybody out on time or well ahead of time tonight. So if everybody's ready, unless you have any questions, we can move out to the other room. Just try to get in tables with 4 or 5, please.
Some of our concerns were that if you transition kids from an existing community into other schools, that it would be really difficult for kids to make that transition and become a part of a whole new school structure. So we like the option 3 because it would give us a better building. It could be made smaller to accommodate the projected numbers. and that it would be the least disruptive possible. It would also keep a staff that, if they spent 20 years together, probably have some, pretty good working relationships. It would hopefully keep all of them together. Just one transition, close the old building, start the new school year in a new building. A couple additional information things that we thought would be helpful was, is there actually a suitable site in the neighborhood? Because that seems like it could be really difficult to find. Actual cost comparisons. Even though building the new school is the most expensive, over the long term, where is that going to get you with the older buildings having much higher costs? And also, what happens to the old site? Are we leaving behind a derelict building? Like, if the old building is not used anymore, what's going to happen to it?
We felt that the opportunities are that the kids would be moved to more modern facilities that will be secure and more accessible to handicaps, etc. There'll be more green space outside, more parking, and this would be by far the most cost-efficient choice as opposed to rebuilding or remodeling the original facility. The challenges are the emotional upheaval of taking the kids and families out of the neighborhood, and also the emotional upheaval of the teachers having to be relocated, and additionally, what the impact on the newer facilities would be with the increase in class sizes, would cause overcrowding in those locations, or potentially just cause other assorted problems that you might encounter with overcrowding.
What happens to these retired buildings? For option 3, when we were taking that into consideration, is how would the new site be acquired to kind of still maintain that sense of community, that neighborhood? And then is the building time for option 2 or option 3 equal? You had mentioned before we broke that we're looking at a 2-year timeline. Is that the same regardless of whether or not we're talking about moving the, rebuilding on that site or rebuilding at a new site? So that's kind of the things that we were looking at.